Erik, Chapter 21. I was dismayed one morning a few months later, when I met with my newly hired assistant Darius. He casually mentioned that Sarah had terminated her contract with us and would not be selling her wares at my carnival anymore. I hastily ended the meeting and burst out the door of my office, almost running to see if I could catch her before she left. I caught her just as she was sealing the last things into a box. She looked at me in surprise as I rushed up to her, catching her wrists and babbling, "Don't go, please, don't go." She calmly detached my hands from her and stepped back.
"Now, whatever do you mean, Erik? I told your assistant why I was terminating my contract. Do you mean to say he didn't tell you?"
I watched her warily, wondering if this would all turn out well or not. I shook my head.
"I'm leaving so that you won't be accused of unethical behavior with an employee. It's not right for you to be romantically involved with a woman you have power over. You know, women such as employees, students."
She paused expectantly. It took me a moment to realize what she had said. Students. Did she know about Christine? She continued.
"I met some French ladies on the ship to America a few years back. At the time, Paris was buzzing with the scandal of a masked man at the opera who had fallen for his singing pupil and abducted her to have his way with her in the cellars of the building. Come to think of it, you must have been in the city at the same time. Did you hear the same rumors?"
The look in her eyes told me that she had already deduced the truth. That, and the fact that she had already packed to leave, meant I had nothing further to hide from her. She would be gone in a matter of minutes, taking my secret with her. "That man was me," I sighed. "But the girl already had a fiancé, and he came and rescued her from me. They're married now, from what I hear. She was never really mine." I omitted the truth about what we had really done together in favor of the lie that Raoul had arrived in time and saved the day by his actions. I couldn't help it. Even now, when I was about to lose her, I still didn't want Sarah to think badly of me.
"I see,"
she said carefully.
"And do you still love her?"
She raised an eyebrow at me. For a moment, I was at a loss of how to respond. Did I still love Christine? I opened and closed my mouth a few times before I finally found words to express myself. I can't say. Not without seeing her again, which, thank heaven, is unlikely on this side of the Atlantic. I don't think I do. I stopped dreaming of her. I trailed off, unsure whether this constituted solid evidence of my feelings or not. To my surprise, Sarah seemed to put great weight on whether or not I dreamt of Christine. She smiled to hear me say that I did not. I didn't relax, however, as I still was left with my original problem. Sarah was leaving, taking off into the wild blue yonder. I couldn't bear to stand here and prolong the goodbye. I lifted her hand, kissed it, and wished her well in her future endeavors. Then I turned to leave before I broke out in unseemly tears. Her hand on my shoulder stopped me.
"Wait, where are you going?"
She pulled me back around to face her. I grew exasperated. Believe it or not, Sarah, I don't meet that many women that I can bear to just stand here as another one waltzes out of my life. I'm going somewhere where I don't have to watch you leave me and pretend to be calm and composed. It's just not something I can do today. I turned again. She caught my hand this time, then pulled me back, threw her arms around my neck again, and kissed me passionately. I let myself believe for a moment that things were as they had ever been with her, and that this wasn't our final kiss. Then cold reality intruded, and I stepped back, shook my head, and lifted her arms from my neck. Her next words stopped me, though.
I'm leaving for you, you fool. I'm leaving my post here so that when we court, you will not be courting your employee. There's no way I'd be able to leave you if it weren't the only ethically correct way to handle this.
She put her hand on her hip, exasperated by my slowness to realize her true motives. I froze as I processed what she had said, then took one giant step toward her, seized her waist in my hands, pulled her close to me, and kissed her again. She kissed me back with equal passion, moaning a little as we tried to get closer to one another. Finally, I broke the kiss, caressing her cheek with my thumb as I looked into her eyes. A smile broke out over my own face, and I sighed in relief. So when will I see you next, then? I suppose this means we have to arrange outings to see one another, like normal couples do. We hastily arranged to meet after the carnival closed, and she gave me an address where I could pick her up. The rest of the day seemed empty. I wandered around from place to place inside my carnival, seeking anything I could find to take my mind off the pleasure I anticipated after we closed. I caught myself walking back to Sarah's empty stall at least a dozen times before remembering that she was no longer there. I sent Darius to the city to hire a carriage for me to use, as I had none of my own. I also asked him to get the biggest bouquet of roses he could find. He returned with both carriage and roses, and I had him park it behind my office until I was ready to leave. The evening started well. I took her to a park and spread a picnic blanket out on the grass beneath the stars. I didn't want to expose her to the stares we would receive if I took her to a restaurant. We fed each other bits of food, enjoying each other's closeness. When the food was gone, I leaned in to kiss her once more. She pulled me down to the blanket, and I rested on top of her briefly while we kissed. Eventually, she pushed me away and sat back up, wrapping her arms around her knees as she turned to me. In a serious tone, she said,
Eric, I can see that eventually we're going to have to take things further, so I think it's important you know now. I was engaged to be married once. He caught some contagion when we arrived in America and was gone in 3 months, leaving me to fend for myself.
I could see the pain cross her face as she recounted this sad story. I put my arm around her shoulders and assured her her history didn't matter to me at all. I felt her shoulders slump in relief as she heard me. She leaned a little closer to me, and I kissed her gently on the forehead. We began to pack up the picnic and prepare to leave. As we worked, the bushes near our picnic spot rustled, and a group of 5 roughly dressed men strolled out and stood around us as we knelt on the ground, packing. One man stepped forward, and it was clear that he was the leader. That was a touching confession, sweetheart. I can't say that your history matters much to me, either. In that, we are in complete agreement, sir. He aimed this last statement at me, then flicked his eyebrows at 2 of his men, who stepped forward and grabbed me by my shoulders and elbows, hauling me to my feet. The remaining 2 men stepped around behind Sarah. I struggled against the men holding me, and the movements caused my mask to fall off. I made a desperate grab for it as it tumbled to the earth, but I missed. The leader seemed taken aback by the ruin of my face, but then he turned to Sarah and said, "Really, honey? This is the man you chose?" Clearly, you didn't know that you can have me instead. I think we'll fix that now. I could see Sarah freeze at the sudden confrontation, and I felt a powerful urge to do the same. But she turned her scared gaze to me, and I knew I could not live with myself if I did not do everything in my power to fix this horrible situation. The leader of the group stepped closer to Sarah and shoved her violently. Come now, sweetheart. This is your lucky night. I'm about to ruin you for your fine friend here. You'll not want to kiss him after you kiss me. His tone changed and he glanced at his accomplices. You boys know the drill. I knew I had to do something. My shoulders and upper arms were restrained, but I had some freedom of movement with my hands. I dug into the pocket of my jacket, searching for the garrote cord I normally carried coiled up in the pocket. I got my hands on one of the ends that I had knotted up for ease of gripping. One glance at my captors showed me their attention was riveted on Sarah. I whipped the cord out of my pocket, praying that it would untangle itself as it came. It did, and with the same movement I flashed the long cord along the legs of the man to my left. He released his grip on me, and I caught the cord with my other hand and got it around the neck of the man to my right. I twisted with all my strength and was surprised to feel him slump to the ground after about 20 seconds. I couldn't tell if he was still alive, but I had other assailants to worry about. I kicked the one I had slashed with the rope in the chest as he came at me, then got my rope around one of the men holding Sarah. He similarly fell to the ground as my rope twisted tight. The one I had kicked recovered and came back at me, but he, too, met with my rope. By the time he fell to the ground, I could see the first one starting to come around. I walked over to him, drew back my foot, and delivered a powerful kick to the head, and he slumped back down. I quickly administered this treatment to the others, as insurance. Meanwhile, Sarah had only one captor and her would-be suitor to contend with. I looked at her just in time to see her draw her fist back and plunge it into the groin of the man holding her. He doubled over, groaning. I got my rope around his neck and twisted it tightly, holding it for longer out of sheer anger that he would attack my dear Sarah. By the time I let the rope go, his pulse had completely stopped. 1 dead, 4 injured, only one of whom remained conscious. I neatly rolled up my cord, crammed it back into my pocket, and pulled Sarah to her feet. We ran for the carriage, leaving our picnic things behind. We leapt into it, and I slapped the reins on the poor horse to get him to move. He galloped away with hooves pounding. I could hear cries of pursuit behind us, but suddenly we were out of the park and onto the main thoroughfare, and the pursuit faded away. I pulled up outside her apartment building, but she did not react to our stopping. I glanced down at my hand, which she had been clutching ever since we got into the carriage. I shook her hand gently, telling her we had stopped. She turned a tear-stained face to me. I had not realized she had been crying. I gathered her into my arms, slowly rocking her back and forth. When she had cried herself out, I sat her upright, got out, tied the horse to a tree, and helped her down from her side of the carriage. I supported her all the way up the stairs to her tiny apartment. When we got inside, I took her straight to the bed in the corner. Far from wanting to treat her as the men in the park had, my only thought was to get her tucked under the covers so she could sleep away the anguish. I got her dress and shoes off and found a nightgown for her to wear over her corset and stockings. She was still dazed and could only give me minimal help, but I pressed forward anyway. I led her to the bed and tucked her under the covers. I kissed her tentatively on the forehead and straightened, ready to turn around and leave. Her weak voice came from behind me just as I placed my hand on the doorknob.
Don't go, Erik. I need you.
A sniffle indicated the danger of the flood of tears renewing itself. I sighed and turned around, going back to the bed. I don't think you should be around men right now, my dear. I think you'll sleep better without me here. I smoothed her hair back from her face. Her hand came out from under the covers and curled itself around my leg where I stood. I can't, Sarah. I couldn't live with myself if I touched you after what I saw tonight. I would only think of myself in the same light as those brutes. I will stay, if you truly want me to. I thought I was doing the best, most gentlemanly thing for her. She nodded her head, seeing my point. I told her I would stay, but I had to deal with the horse and carriage. By the time I got back inside, she was sleeping lightly in the bed. I studied her lovely face for a brief moment before taking off shoes, jacket, and mask and sliding in beside her. I gathered her gently into my arms and heard her give a breath of a moan at the sensation. I pressed her head back against my chest and whispered in her ear, "Sleep." That was the night that I knew I had to make her my wife. I had long seen marriage as something that would make me fit in better with other men, something that would help me to feel less isolated. With Christine, I'd seen marriage as a way to legitimize our union and give me access to her body and ownership of her voice, first and foremost. It wasn't until that night that I first realized how marriage would bond two hearts and minds together and make me a part of a unit, while at the same time giving me the responsibility to protect my wife. The thought lit up my mind like an electric light bulb, and I thought I would not get to sleep because of the combined intensity of this thought and the feel of her sleeping calmly in my arms. But before I knew it, I was waking up to the sunshine of a new morning, with Sarah turning in my arms to wish me good morning. I kissed her once more, a little more passionately now that she seemed somewhat recovered. Then I rose, dressed myself again, and left before I did something I might regret. I wanted to be able to offer my future wife something of value besides my own ravaged carcass and a two-bit carnival. So from that day forward, I began to visit other carnivals and sideshows in the area, targeting their most interesting and talented performers and offering them incentives to come perform for me instead. In some cases, I had to do as Antoinette had done for me, enlisting a lawyer to examine their contracts, and then bringing the police to release them from unlawful captivity. My carnival began to grow by leaps and bounds as my new performers told their friends about the good treatment they were receiving from the man who had an intimate understanding of what it was like to be one of them. With the new additions came trouble of a new kind. Several carnival owners banded together to bring a suit against me for enticing their star performers away. It seemed suspiciously easy to procure a fairly priced lawyer to defend myself, a phenomenon I never once thought to ascribe to Meg's interventions until it was far too late to prevent her. Meg continued to be devoted to me, although she tried her best to hide it. On the few occasions I recognized it in her, it always bothered me a little that she was wasting her life pining after me, when I simply couldn't bring myself to reciprocate her affection. I always resolved to say something to stop her from doing this, but I could never figure out what to say, and other matters took my attention. It continued to be one of those problems that one just wishes would go away. As my 29th summer began, I found myself more eager than ever to ask Sarah to be my wife. I decided to take her out to celebrate my birthday and make that the big occasion for my proposal. I picked her up and we drove into the city. I would brave the stares that we would be certain to attract. We pulled up at a restaurant, and I descended from the carriage, running around to her side to help her down. She alighted gracefully and stood on the sidewalk, dressed to the nines in a purple dress with beaded trim. She adjusted her wrap around her shoulders and held out her hand to me. I tucked it under my arm and pulled her toward the restaurant door. Inside, we left our light wraps with the coat check. The attendant froze with his hand held out as he saw me take off my hat, revealing the mask beneath it, but then he shook himself, accepted my hat, and provided me with the claim ticket. I pulled Sarah back into my arm, and we swept into the grand dining room after the maitre d'. I asked for a table where we could overlook the center of the room, hoping to avoid stares at us as we dined. He settled us at a table on the upper level, in a booth with a horseshoe bench curving around it, shielded by red velvet curtains. It was perfect. I pulled the curtain on my side to hide myself, but left it up to Sarah whether to pull hers. I rather liked the idea that other people might stare at her and wonder who was lucky enough to be here with her. Wine and water arrived, then appetizers and menus. We made our selections and handed the menus back to the waiter. Sarah opened the conversation.
So, you say it is your birthday. How old are you then, may I ask?
I believe I am 29, although I can't say for sure. As a foster child, I never had any official confirmation of when my birthday is. I always count my birthday as the first day of summer. And as far as I can calculate, I think this is my 29th. I shrugged. The lack of certainty about my age had long since ceased to bother me.
Ah,
she replied. I didn't think my age bothered her. I already knew she was 26, which was a perfectly acceptable gap between lovers.
This is a really beautiful restaurant, Erik. Do you always celebrate your birthday in such style?
Her gaze darted out over the sea of diners, then back to me. I read suspicion, mixed with hope, love, and encouragement in her eyes. She knew we weren't only here for my birthday. I took a deep breath, then reached up and took off my mask. The curtain hid me from everyone in the room except Sarah. I wanted all my cards on the table as I asked her this question. Sarah, my darling, there is another reason we are here. In these last few months I have come to know you and to love you. It astounds me every time I see you look at me without cringing. You don't know how much it comforts me to be around someone who sees the human being trapped behind this horror show. I gestured to my face. If you think you can stand the sight, I want to provide for you for the rest of your life, as my wife. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms each night. Will you marry me? She put her hand to her mouth and her eyes filled with tears. This is it, I thought. This is where she tells me she wouldn't marry me if I were the last man on earth. I was already preparing what I would say to assure her I held no ill will after she rejected me. My mind was whirling so fast and my heart was pounding in my ears so strongly that I didn't even register the fact that she had said something. She had to repeat herself.
Yes. Yes, Erik, I will marry you. Did you hear me?
I suddenly snapped back to the present moment and reviewed what I had heard her say, still unable to believe that she had answered affirmatively. When it registered with me, I felt wild joy rising up from within me. She had accepted. We were engaged. I slid myself around the table to her side of the bench seat, heedless of the fact that the curtain there was wide open and I didn't have my mask on. I took her head in both my hands and kissed her passionately when we were interrupted by the tactful cough of the waiter, arriving with our first course. I got myself arranged back on my own side of the bench, mask in place once more. I straightened my waistcoat as I got myself situated, and the presence of a bulge in the pocket made me smack my head at my forgetfulness. The ring! I had forgotten to give her the ring! Hastily, I fished the box out of my pocket, stammering excuses for my forgetfulness. I pushed it across the table to Sarah. She giggled and opened the box, revealing the amethyst and diamond ring I had chosen for her. I took the box back from her, removed the ring, and lifted her hand to put it on her. It was a perfect fit, and it matched her dress beautifully. 4 months later, I stood at the front of a church and placed a plain gold wedding band on that same finger. When the amethyst ring was replaced next to it, the two together were beautiful, but it was more than that was making my heart swell. Those two together meant she was mine. How I endured the dinner afterward that all my carnival employees threw for us, I'm not sure. I only watched Sarah as she listened to the speeches and laughed at I knew not what jokes and quips at our expense. I spent much of the time twisting the new, unfamiliar weight of my wedding band around and around my finger. The onyx ring was gone, secured in the safe deposit box. Finally, it was time to leave, and I handed my wife up into the cab, marveling all the while at the sweetness of the phrase, my wife. Everyone crowded around to wish us well as we departed the banquet hall. We took the cab back to my tiny little flat. I knew it was scarcely big enough for two, but I had plans in place to purchase a bigger home for us. I'd been so scared that something would go wrong, that the wedding would be canceled, that I hadn't purchased the home quite yet. She stood looking around my place. She had entrusted me with some of her things already, and I had put them around in prominent places for her to see and use. She also carried a valise full of more immediate essentials. I took it from her and led her to where I had placed 2 chairs in front of the stove. I sat her in one chair and knelt in front of her to take off her shoes and stockings. She had worn a pale lavender gown today for the wedding, and it complemented her upswept blonde locks beautifully. I unpinned her hair and brushed it out for her. This task finished, I ran my fingers up beneath her hair, massaging her scalp and making her groan with relief. I ran my hands down her slender neck, over her shoulders and down her arms, then stood in front of her and took a deep breath. We came together like 2 magnets with an instant attraction. I walked her backward to the bed as we kissed, and we tumbled onto it. She wrapped her arms around me as we kissed. After some time, she suddenly tensed and relaxed beneath me. Slowly, we both recovered from our first experience as husband and wife. I felt my pulse return to normal. I pulled the quilt up over both of us, myself and my wife, and we drifted off together to sleep.